Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. It was a cold, rainy night in California. I remember the heavy sound of raindrops hitting my window like an ominous drum beat. The sky had been dark all evening, and I was curled up on the couch after a long day of work. My house was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I live alone, and that night I was completely by myself. I had just finished watching some random show on Netflix and reached for the remote to turn off the TV. As I pressed the power button, a strange silence seemed to take over the room. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt uneasy. It's like the air had shifted, and something in my gut was telling me that I wasn't alone anymore. But I just brushed it off. Maybe it was just the loneliness playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. They were footsteps, heavy, deliberate, like someone was walking down the hallway that leads to the bedrooms. I froze, my heart starting to race. It couldn't be. No one else was supposed to be here. I sat still, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, thinking maybe I was just imagining it. But then they started again, only this time, closer. Someone was in my house. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Could it be a neighbor? Maybe a prank? But no one had called or texted, and I hadn't heard any cars pull up. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized how eerily quiet it had gotten. Even the rain seemed distant now. I slowly got up from the couch, my legs shaking beneath me. My first instinct was to go check the front door. Maybe it was just the wind or someone knocking. But as I started moving toward the hallway, I heard a low sound, a door creaking open. My heart sank. Someone was in my house. Didn't know what to do. Should I call 911? Should I confront them? I felt like I was going to be sick, but my body moved before I could think. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and dialed the police. My hands were trembling as I whispered, "Someone's in my house. I need help." As I stood there, listening to the faint clicking sound of footsteps against the hardwood floor, I realized I was trapped. I couldn't just walk outside or rush past whoever was there. I had to stay quiet, stay hidden. The footsteps stopped again. My heart thudded in my chest as I pressed myself against the wall, waiting. Everything seemed so much louder now. The rain outside, the beating of my own pulse. And then, just as I was beginning to think maybe I had imagined it all, the doorknob to the living room started to turn. I froze. The door creaked open just a little bit, and in the dim light, I saw a figure step into the room. A man. I don't know how I didn't scream. The guy looked disheveled, like he'd been wandering for days. His clothes were torn, his face was pale, and his eyes were wide, almost frantic. He didn't seem to care about the fact that I could see him. He just stepped inside and looked around. My stomach turned as he moved closer. I could barely breathe as he walked toward the kitchen. It was like he was searching for something, anything. I don't know how long he stayed in that room before he finally noticed me standing there, frozen. His eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then, just as quickly, he rushed toward me. I barely had time to react. He shoved me aside and lunged for my phone, which I had gripped tightly in my hand. I tried to fight him off, but he was stronger, more desperate. My face collided with his arm as I struggled to break free. I wasn't going to let him take my phone. I didn't know what he wanted, but I couldn't let him take away my only means of defense. He slapped my hand and tried to grab it, and for a moment I thought I was done for. But somehow I managed to push him off. My heart was pounding in my throat as I darted away from him, backing up into the hallway. He was still coming, and the fear coursing through me made me act on instinct. I ran for my bedroom. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the knob. I could hear him pounding on the door from the other side, shouting something I couldn't make out. But I didn't care. I just needed to stay alive. I quickly pulled my phone from my pocket and hit the emergency call button again. The police operator answered almost immediately, and I whispered the address, still listening to the man outside. I don't know how much longer I would have been able to stay quiet. Luckily, the police arrived just in time. I heard the sirens in the distance, and moments later I could hear the front door being kicked in. The man screamed, and then nothing. The police found him in the living room, trying to pry open the window. He was arrested on the spot. They said he had a history of home invasions, but this time he had chosen the wrong house. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't managed to lock myself in that room. I don't know if I would have been hurt or if he had planned to take something more than just my phone. I'll never be able to shake the image of him standing there in my living room, looking so desperate, like he didn't have anything to lose. Now, every time I hear footsteps in the hallway, even when I know I'm alone, I can't help but feel that same rush of terror. I never thought much about being home alone. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I'm 18, live in a small town in California, and usually enjoy the peace and quiet when my parents are away. On a quiet summer night, it felt like nothing could go wrong. But that night, well, let's just say it was anything but ordinary. Looking back, I wish I could have done things differently. This is the story of the worst night of my life. A night that made me realize how quickly a peaceful evening can turn into a nightmare. It was one of those summer nights when the air is thick with humidity. You know, the kind of night when you can almost taste the rain that's about to fall. The smell of wet asphalt started to linger outside as dark clouds rolled in. My parents had left for a short weekend trip to visit my aunt, so I was by myself at the house. Everything about that evening seemed normal. I remember finishing dinner, watching TV in the living room. The rain began to tap lightly against the windows, adding a soft, almost rhythmic sound to the background. I didn't mind being alone. Actually, I kind of liked it. There's something comforting about the emptiness of a quiet house, the feeling that you can just let your mind wander. But that night, my mind wasn't going to get the chance. It was just after 9 p.m. when I heard the first knock. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. A single knock at the front door. It wasn't hard or fast, just a steady knock. I stood up, confused. It was pouring outside. Who would be knocking on my door in the middle of a storm? I glanced at the clock. 9:30 p.m. My parents were still hours away from coming back. I peeked through the window by the door. Two men stood there, both wearing baseball caps and dark jackets. The man closest to the door looked to be in his late 30s, his face hardened by years of life experience, while the other man, probably a few years younger, kept glancing around nervously. Something about them felt off. Maybe it was the way they were standing, too close to each other, like they were waiting for something. But I didn't think much of it at first. I thought maybe they were lost or looking for directions, so I opened the door just a crack. "Hey, sorry to bother you," the older man said, his voice polite but somehow cold. "Is your mom or dad home? We're just trying to get in touch with them. We've got some important business to discuss." I didn't recognize either of them, but their faces didn't look threatening, just unfamiliar. "I'm home alone," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "My parents aren't here. They're out of town." The older man gave a half smile, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. "Oh, I see. Well, Can we wait for them? It's important. I hesitated. The request seemed odd, and I couldn't put my finger on why, but there was something about the way they looked at each other, almost like they were waiting for me to say yes. I'm really sorry, I said, shaking my head. I don't think they'll be back until late. I don't think it's a good idea to wait here. There was a pause, and the younger man spoke up, his voice a little too eager. You sure? We could wait inside. It won't be long. I can't, I said, my voice a little firmer. They won't be back tonight. They exchanged another glance, and I felt the air grow tense. Well, all right, the older man said with a slight shrug. Thanks anyway. We'll leave you to it. They turned and started walking down the driveway, but I didn't feel relieved. I stood there, watching them go, my heart racing. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I tried to push the feeling away, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had just watched too many crime documentaries or read too many scary stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't left. I kept checking the front window, watching for any sign of movement, but the street remained empty. I went back to the couch, tried to calm myself down, and even turned on the TV to distract myself. But then, there it was again. The knock. It was louder this time, and there was no hesitation. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood up, my mind racing. There was no way they had come back already. I couldn't be sure, but something about the knock this time felt different. I slowly approached the door, looking through the peephole, and saw them standing there again. The younger man was still glancing around nervously, but now the older man's expression was much more serious, even angry. I felt a surge of fear rush through me. I didn't open the door this time. I stayed silent, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to make any noise or give myself away. Hey, the older man called out, his voice louder this time. We just want to talk to your parents. We know they're here. I could hear the underlying threat in his tone. They weren't leaving until they got what they wanted. I had to make a decision. I didn't feel safe anymore, and I didn't trust these men. I had to get away from the door. I quickly grabbed my phone, ran to the back of the house, and ducked into my parents' bedroom. I locked the door behind me and crawled under the bed, hoping they wouldn't hear me. I called 911, my voice trembling as I whispered into the phone. They're outside, I whispered frantically. 2 men. They won't leave. They're trying to get in. The dispatcher told me to stay calm and stay hidden. As I waited, I heard their voices outside talking to each other in low murmurs. My heart was racing. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear them moving around, testing windows, checking the back door. The next few minutes felt like hours. I felt my body tense as I heard the sound of someone trying the back door handle. I stifled a scream. They were in the yard. When the police finally arrived, it was chaos. The officers stormed the house, and I could hear the men shouting as they were arrested. I stayed hidden under the bed until I heard the door kick open, and I felt a rush of relief. One of the officers came in and helped me out, telling me everything was going to be all right. They took my statement, and later that night, they told me the horrifying truth. The 2 men were part of a local break-in crew. They had been targeting houses with no one home, but this time they had made the mistake of thinking I was alone. They had seen my parents leave earlier that day, but they didn't realize I was still there. They didn't want to talk to my parents like they had said. No. They were there to rob the house. And if I had opened that door, I shuddered to think of what might have happened. I haven't been able to forget that night. Every knock on the door makes my heart race, and every time I'm home alone, I check the locks twice, just to be sure. It's not the same anymore. That feeling of safety, that sense of peace is gone. And I'll never forget the look in the older man's eyes, the way he seemed to know, deep down, that I was more than just an inconvenience to him. I was a problem. That night, I learned just how quickly things can go wrong, and how dangerous it can be to trust a stranger knocking at your door. This happened when I was about 17 years old, back in high school. It was a Friday night, and I was home alone. My parents had gone out to some work thing. I wasn't really in the mood to go, so I stayed behind, figuring I could get some peace and quiet. I don't know why, but I always felt like I could be more myself when I was alone. The house was quiet, too quiet sometimes, but I didn't mind it. I lived in a pretty normal suburban neighborhood in California. Nothing too fancy, but not run down either. The house itself was a little older than most around it, and it had that creaky floorboard kind of charm, the kind that makes you jump when you hear footsteps, even when no one's around. That night, the weather was, well, it was a mess. It had started raining hard around dinner time. I could hear the rain pounding against the windows mixed with the occasional thunder. The wind was so bad, the trees were swaying like they were about to break. It was one of those nights where you're just waiting for something to happen, but you don't know what. The kind of night where you're just a little bit too far away from the rest of the world. I had the TV on in the living room, but the sound of the rain outside was so loud it drowned out most of the show. The power flickered once or twice, but the lights stayed on. Still, the house felt weird. Like there was a weight to it, an almost suffocating silence that wrapped around me. I wasn't scared, at least I didn't think I was. But every so often, I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder like someone was standing just behind me. I was about to get up to grab something from the kitchen when I heard it. Footsteps. I froze. I don't know why I even thought about it for a second, but my mind automatically went to my mom. Maybe she'd come home early or something. It was normal for her to come in after a late meeting, sometimes without even calling first. But I remember this clearly. I looked at the clock. It was already past midnight. She wasn't due back until around 1 a.m., maybe later. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. It was probably just the wind or one of those old creaky floors I told you about. So I shrugged it off and continued flipping through the channels. But then I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate. Like someone was walking through the house. Okay, this is strange. I got up slowly and walked toward the hallway. The house was completely dark except for the faint glow of the TV in the living room. The rest of the rooms were silent. The rain outside was coming down in sheets now, battering the windows like someone was throwing rocks at them. I tiptoed down the hallway to the stairs, but there was nothing. The floor creaked under my weight, but I kept listening. I didn't hear any more footsteps. I figured maybe I was hearing things. Maybe it was just my imagination. But then I heard the door downstairs creak open. At that point, my heart dropped. My mom wouldn't just open the door like that. The front door had a very distinctive sound when it opened, and it was definitely the front door. I could feel my body tense up. This wasn't right. I tried calling my mom's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. My mind raced. Was it a burglar? Was someone just coming in? My parents had been robbed once a few years ago, and I guess in the back of my mind, I thought maybe it was happening again. The house wasn't exactly the safest in the neighborhood. There had been some break-ins recently. I decided to investigate. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the side table, and crept quietly down the stairs. The air felt cold, way too cold for a California night. The wind rattled the windows again, but I barely noticed it. My focus was on the stairs below me, on the front door that was now slightly ajar. I couldn't see anyone in the hallway, but I could hear shuffling, like someone was moving around in there. My heart was pounding in my chest now. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The dark hallway seemed endless, and I felt like I was walking through thick molasses, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I was getting closer to the front door, and I could feel the hairs on my neck stand up. The door was still open, just a crack, and I could see a faint silhouette of someone standing in the living room just beyond the door. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the hallway just past the doorframe. A man. He was standing still, facing the hallway, but I could see the outline of something in his hand. Something metallic. A knife. My brain couldn't process it at first. It was like I was frozen in place, staring at the figure, unable to make any noise or move. He was just standing there, watching me from the shadows. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was looking at me. His presence was suffocating. I could feel the chill from across the room, the darkness like it was pressing against me. I don't even remember moving at first, but suddenly I was sprinting toward the stairs, my heart in my throat. The lamp slipped from my hand and crashed to the floor, but I didn't care. I ran up the stairs so fast I almost tripped. My legs felt like jelly. I slammed the door to my bedroom shut and locked it as quickly as I could, my hands shaking like crazy. I grabbed my phone, barely able to hold it still. 911. The operator answered after what felt like forever. 911, what's your emergency? I could barely speak. My voice was shaky and uneven. Someone's in my house. I'm home alone. The operator tried to calm me down, telling me they'd send someone right away. But every second felt like an eternity. I pressed my back against the door, staring at the knob, waiting for it to turn. Every little noise outside made my heart jump. It felt like hours before I finally heard the sirens. The police arrived a few minutes later, shining their flashlights through the windows and banging on the door. I ran downstairs to meet them, trying to keep myself together, but when we searched the house, he was gone. There was no sign of anyone. The front door was still open a crack, but the figure had vanished. The police checked every room, every closet, but nothing. I never found out who it was or why they were there. But I haven't been home alone since. It was one of those typical rainy nights in California where the air's thick with moisture and the sound of water slapping against the windows is like a constant whisper. I was alone in my house, a modest 3-bedroom in the suburbs. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and for the most part, I liked being alone. The rain outside, heavy and steady, had been coming down for hours, and I was sitting in the living room watching some random Netflix show on my TV, trying to kill time. The house wasn't anything special, just a couple of mismatched couches, a small coffee table, and the TV across from me. The walls were bare, except for a few old family photos that I never really looked at. I wasn't in the mood to do anything productive that night. Nothing exciting. I just wanted to relax. I was getting into the show when, without warning, the lights flickered once, twice, then went completely out. I didn't think much of it at first. Power outages happen all the time around here, especially with the rain and wind. I grabbed my phone to check for any notifications, but of course the battery was down to 4%. Classic me, always forgetting to charge it. I sighed, set the phone on the coffee table, and got up to grab some candles. The dim flicker of candlelight always made me feel a little more at ease during these moments. I lit 3 candles and set them around the living room, then plopped back down on the couch. The rain was still coming down outside, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the room. Without the light from the TV, the room felt colder, quieter, like the darkness outside was creeping in, making everything feel a little more unsettling. The rain outside was getting heavier, and the wind was picking up, making the windows rattle. I'd lived in this house for a couple of years now, and I'd gotten used to the noises, but that night, something about the way the wind howled against the house gave me an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing little creaks from somewhere behind me. I know it sounds dumb, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The house was dead silent aside from the wind, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing there in the dark. Nothing was there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Maybe it was the isolation of the power outage. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Either way, I kept trying to distract myself. That's when I noticed it, the reflection in the TV screen. At first, it was so faint that I thought I was imagining it, but then it became clearer. In the reflection of the black TV screen, I saw something move. It wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. It was like someone was standing right behind me. My heart dropped into my stomach, and for a moment, I froze. The candlelight flickered, casting a dim, wavering glow across the room, and I kept my eyes fixed on the reflection, too scared to move. It wasn't my reflection. No, this was different. It was someone else. It wasn't clear at first, but as I watched, I saw the figure move again, just a little, and I could tell it was a person. My breath caught in my throat. Who the hell was in my house? I hadn't heard the door open. I had locked everything before sitting down. I hadn't seen or heard anything that suggested someone was here. I turned my head slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever it was. But the moment I turned, the figure in the reflection disappeared, vanishing like smoke in the air. My heart was racing now, and my stomach was churning. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound, but my feet felt heavy as I crept toward the hallway. I didn't hear any more movement. The house felt eerily still, but my skin was prickling, and every sense in my body screamed that something was wrong. I moved toward the hallway, every step feeling like a lifetime. When I reached the edge of the hallway, I glanced down the dark corridor toward the front door. The door was still locked, but there was something about it. The door frame was darker than usual, and the little light that came in from the candles didn't reach it quite the same way. I stepped closer, slowly, cautiously, my mind racing through all the possible explanations. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just freaking myself out. That's when I saw it. The faintest shadow near the edge of the door, just out of the corner of my eye. I froze. Then I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like someone slowly dragging their hand along the wood of the door. I felt my blood run cold. In that moment, I realized someone was in my house. I could hear them breathing, quiet and steady, but frantic at the same time. They were sneaking around, trying to be as quiet as possible. Before I could process what was happening, I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, not caring how stupid I sounded, hoping against hope that anyone would hear me. I was shaking, my entire body trembling, and for what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. But then, I heard the figure bolt, running out the front door and into the storm. I could hear them stumbling over themselves in the wet, slippery grass outside. The wind howled louder, drowning out most of the sound, but I could still hear their feet hitting the ground, disappearing into the rain. I stood there for what felt like forever, heart pounding in my chest, too scared to move. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold on to the candles. I could barely even think. I didn't sleep at all that night. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't screamed. I don't know who was in my house or why they had been there. But when I checked the door later, there were no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no open windows, just the faintest trace of mud on the floor. Whoever it was, they were good at being quiet. They were good at being sneaky. But they were still just a little too slow. I'm never staying in the dark again. Not like that. Not alone. It was one of those nights in California. Dark, wet, and uncomfortable. The rain was relentless, pelting the windows in a steady rhythm that felt almost like a constant whisper, keeping me company in the otherwise quiet house. You know the kind of night I'm talking about. It's the type of evening where even the streetlights outside look dim and blurry through the rain, their glow not really reaching the darkened sidewalks. It was the sort of night you'd usually just want to cozy up with a blanket and a good movie. But I wasn't doing that. Instead, I was in my kitchen, alone, making myself a cup of tea. The kitchen was small and quiet. There were no pets to distract me or keep me company, just me and the steady drip of the rain against the glass. My little house was tucked away in the suburbs of California, in a neighborhood where everyone pretty much kept to themselves. The neighbors were friendly enough, but there was never anything that would make you feel uneasy. No reason to look over your shoulder. I had just finished a long day working from home, dealing with endless emails and Zoom calls when I decided it was time to wind down. It was about 10:30 p.m. when I started making the tea. It's funny how mundane tasks like that, just boiling water, adding a tea bag, and stirring, can be so comforting after a long day. The kettle started to whistle loudly, the sound filling the empty space in the kitchen. I could feel the warmth of the steam rising from it, and it was almost like a reminder that I could finally relax. I reached for my mug on the counter, the plain white one I always used, and as I did, I noticed my phone lying there as well. It was face up, just sitting there in the glow of the kitchen light. I could have picked it up, maybe checked if I had any messages or notifications, but honestly, I didn't feel like it. I just wanted a quiet evening. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so subtle that I thought I was imagining it. A creak. Not the kind that you hear when the house settles, but something more deliberate. A sound that was almost purposeful. I froze, holding the mug midair, my ears strained, trying to make sense of it. There was no wind tonight, no draft to cause something to creak. The windows were shut tight, the house was sealed. It was just me, the kettle, and the rain outside. But the sound wasn't over. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a door moving, not too loudly but enough to catch my attention. I was confused at first. The front door was locked when I got home. I'd made sure of it. I always double-check the locks when I come home, especially at night. But the sound, it wasn't right. The door wasn't just creaking. It sounded like it was opening. And when you live alone, even the slightest abnormal noise can send your mind spiraling. I put the mug down carefully, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had gotten. All I could hear now was the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears and the gentle hum of the kettle, still boiling. The world outside was a blur of rain and dark shapes, but inside it was deathly still. I glanced toward the living room, which I could see from where I stood. The front door was visible, just a few feet away from the entrance to the kitchen, and the shadows behind it seemed almost too still. I strained my ears trying to listen. Another creak, a few seconds of silence, then a slow, deliberate step. That's when it hit me. Someone was in my house. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the counter, but it was too far for me to reach quickly. Should I call the police? Should I just hide? Another step, this time closer. I could hear the light tap of shoes on the hardwood floor. The sound was so soft, almost cautious, as if whoever was in my house didn't want to be heard. I could feel my pulse racing now, my whole body tense with fear as I thought about the layout of the house. The kitchen connected to the living room and the hallway. The front door was right at the end of the hall. I could see it barely from the kitchen door. There was no way out. No back door, no basement, just the front and the windows, which were now blocked by the rain. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't going to panic. Think. Stay calm. You've got this. I grabbed my phone, but before I could unlock it, the screen went black. Of course. The battery had died. I let out a frustrated sigh. It didn't help that the damn thing had been dying all day, but I figured I'd charge it later. The footsteps continued. I could feel my stomach churn as I made my way into the living room. I crouched down, just enough so that I could peek around the corner and get a glimpse of the front door. I didn't want to risk being spotted, but at this point, I had no choice but to know who I was dealing with. Through the shadows, I could see the faint outline of a person standing near the door. It was hard to make out much more than that, just a figure, tall, but I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. The only thing I could see clearly was the way the moonlight glinted off of something he or she was holding, a glint that made my stomach drop. I didn't know. I didn't know if I was ready to face whatever it was I had just seen. My brain was screaming at me to run, to do something, do anything. But all I could do was hold my breath and wait, watching the figure standing still. Time felt like it had slowed down. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my neck, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But I couldn't look away. I couldn't breathe. Then, without warning, the door creaked open fully, just enough to let the figure step inside. I stood up quickly, trying to be as quiet as possible. My heart was hammering in my chest as I backed away toward the kitchen. The adrenaline rushed through my veins. My mind was racing, get to the knife, get to the knife. But I couldn't even think straight. The figure was getting closer. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter. My hand was shaking so much I almost dropped it. But I held on, my fingers tightening around the handle. I could feel the steel digging into my palm as I gripped it harder, preparing myself for whatever would happen next. The footsteps grew louder as the person stepped into the hallway, heading toward the kitchen. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew I had to act quickly. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grab my arm from behind, yanking me back into the darkness of the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could react, another hand shot out, covering my mouth, stifling my scream. I froze. The person was stronger than I had imagined, and I was completely caught off guard. My whole body went cold, and I could feel the panic rising. I struggled, kicking my legs, trying to break free, but the grip was unrelenting. I swung the knife wildly, aiming for anything I could reach. My heart raced in my chest as the blade connected. I didn't know if I had hit anything vital, but I felt the person's grip loosen just enough for me to break free. Without thinking, I bolted. I ran down the hall, desperate to escape. I could hear him behind me, footsteps pounding, but I didn't look back. I reached the front door, my hands fumbling to unlock it. The rain was pouring outside, but I didn't care. I threw the door open and ran as fast as I could, pounding on my neighbor's door. When she answered, I collapsed into her arms, breathless and terrified. I dialed 911 from my neighbor's phone, my voice barely more than a whisper, as I explained everything that had just happened. The operator was calm, but I could hear the urgency in her voice as she reassured me that help was on the way. I tried to steady my breathing, my heart still racing as I thought about the figure in my house, the coldness of the hand that had grabbed me. But just as I started to feel the slightest relief, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. When the police arrived, I was still struggling to calm down. One officer quickly asked me to stay put, while others began scanning the street outside. A few moments later, I heard shouting, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps pounding the wet pavement. I turned to see one of the officers running after someone. It was him, the intruder. He was fast, too fast, but the officer's shout grew louder, and the man stumbled as he tried to sprint down the slippery street. He didn't get far. Within seconds, the officer tackled him to the ground, securing him with cuffs. I could only stand there, my knees trembling, as I watched the man struggle against the officers. The officer reassured me that I was safe now, but something deep in my gut told me it wasn't over. That feeling stayed with me long after the police left, long after the rain had stopped. Even though they had caught him, the fear lingered in the back of my mind. A part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else. Something far darker that I'd just narrowly escaped. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.